The dust from the burial ground still clung to Margaret Nelson's black dress when she realized she had nothing left but two frightened children who were not her own. She stood in front of the modest home her brother James had built with his own hands, watching his daughter Emma, barely 7 years old, clutching 4-year-old Thomas like he might disappear into the Colorado earth just as their parents had. Margaret was 23, unmarried, and now the only family these children had left after a fever took both James and his wife Sarah within 3 days of each other in the winter of 1878. Gunnison was a hard town in a hard land, carved out of the wilderness where the Gunnison River cut through valleys that could be breathtaking one moment and deadly the next. Margaret had arrived from Denver just 2 days before her brother died, summoned by a neighbor's urgent telegram. She had expected to help nurse him back to health, not to stand beside 2 fresh graves while the January wind bit through her coat. Aunt Maggie. Emma's voice was small, almost lost in the sound of the wind rattling the wooden shutters. Are we going to leave now? Margaret knelt down, ignoring the mud that would stain her dress, and pulled both children close. No, sweetheart, this is your home. We are staying right here. It was a promise she meant with every fiber of her being, even though she had no idea how to keep it. Margaret had been working as a seamstress in Denver, living in a boarding house, sending money home to her widowed mother. She knew how to thread a needle, how to fit a dress, how to stretch a dollar until it screamed. She did not know the first thing about running the small ranch her brother had been trying to build, about the cattle that needed feeding, or the hay that needed cutting, or the fence lines that needed mending. The reality of her situation became clearer with each passing day. The ranch was small, just 40 acres with a dozen head of cattle, a few chickens, and a horse so old Margaret worried it might die just from looking at it wrong. James had been building something, but he had been building slowly, carefully, and now that careful progress had come to a halt. The mortgage payment was due in 3 months. The supplies in the house would last maybe 6 weeks if she was careful. Margaret taught herself to milk the cow, burning through her patience, and the cows when her city-bred hands could not find the right rhythm. She gathered eggs with Emma's help, learning which hens were docile and which would peck at her fingers like they had a personal grudge. She tried to fix the sagging barn door and nearly brought the whole frame down on her head. Thomas watched everything with solemn eyes, too young to understand death, but old enough to know his whole world had changed. 3 weeks after the funeral, Margaret was in the general store, counting out coins for flour and sugar, when she heard the whispers. 2 women stood by the fabric, speaking in voices they probably thought were quiet enough. Shame about those children. City girl like that has no business trying to run a ranch. Won't last the spring. She will have to sell or lose it to the bank. Those babies will end up in an orphanage, mark my words. Margaret's hands shook as she gathered her purchases. She held her head high as she walked past the women, but their words followed her home and kept her awake that night. She knew they were right. She was failing, drowning slowly, and she was going to take Emma and Thomas down with her. February brought snow that piled up past the windows. Margaret learned to split wood, blistering her hands until they bled, then toughening up until she could swing the axe without wincing. She learned to check the cattle's water, breaking the ice that formed overnight. She learned to make a single chicken stretch across 3 days of meals. She learned that she could function on 4 hours of sleep, rocking Thomas through his nightmares and holding Emma when she cried for her mother. What she could not learn, what no amount of determination could teach her, was how to do the heavy work that kept a ranch running. The cattle needed to be moved to different pasture. The roof had a leak she could not reach. The fence on the eastern border was falling down, and she did not have the strength to set new posts. She was standing in that eastern pasture in early March, staring at the sagging fence and trying not to cry from sheer frustration, when she heard the horse approaching. Margaret looked up, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun, and saw a man on a massive bay gelding riding toward her property line. He was tall even on horseback, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and shoulders broad enough that she could see their width from a distance. As he drew closer, she could make out a weathered face that might have been handsome if not for the severity of his expression. He wore a brown coat, good quality but worn from use, and sat his horse like a man who had been born in the saddle. The man stopped at the property line, right where her broken fence met his intact one. "Afternoon," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am Colton Garrison. I own the ranch that borders yours to the east." Margaret wiped her hands on her already dirty skirt, aware of how she must look with her hair falling out of its pins and mud on her face. "Margaret Nelson, this was my brother's place. I heard about James. I am sorry for your loss. He was a good man." Colton's gray eyes studied the broken fence, then shifted to her. "This fence is going to let my cattle drift onto your land or yours onto mine. It needs fixing. I know that." Margaret lifted her chin. "I will repair it. When?" It was not said unkindly, but it was direct. "Soon." "You've been saying that to yourself for how long now?" He dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the ground with solid thuds. Up close, he was even taller than she had thought, and younger than his serious demeanor suggested. Maybe 30 at most. "You know how to set fence posts." "I can learn. Maybe. But winter is not done with us yet, and this fence will be flat on the ground by the time you figure it out." He walked along the fence line, examining it with a practiced eye. "I will have my men come repair it tomorrow." Pride flared hot in Margaret's chest. "I cannot pay you, did not ask you to." "I do not need charity, Mr. Garrison." He turned to face her, and something flickered across his expression. Frustration, maybe, or impatience. "It is not charity, it is being a neighbor. James would have done the same. James is dead." The words came out harsher than she intended. "And I am not James. I can see that." Colton studied her for a long moment, and Margaret felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. "How are you managing, Miss Nelson?" "Honestly, fine." The lie felt bitter on her tongue. "That's so." "Then, why have your cattle been coming over onto my land looking for food because your pasture is overgrazed? Why is there smoke coming from your chimney at all hours, like you are burning every stick of furniture to keep warm because you are running out of firewood? Why did I see you in town last week buying the smallest quantities the store would sell?" Margaret felt her face flush hot with shame and anger. "You have been spying on me." "I have been watching a woman work herself to death trying to do the job of 3 men, all while raising 2 small children." His voice was still calm, matter-of-fact, which somehow made it worse. "No shame in that, but no sense in it either. What would you have me do? Abandon my brother's children, sell this place and send them to an orphanage?" Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. "This is their home. It is all they have left of their parents. I did not say anything about abandoning anyone." Colton crossed his arms over his chest. "I am saying you need help, real help, not just mending one fence. And where exactly am I supposed to find that help? I have no money to hire ranch hands. I can barely afford to feed us." The admission cost her, but there was no point in pretending anymore. This man had already seen through every lie she had been telling herself. Colton was quiet for a moment, looking out over her small ranch, at the house with its smoking chimney, at the barn that was listing slightly to one side. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Those kids, Emma and Thomas, right? They are your brothers." "Yes, I am all they have." "They need stability. They need someone who can provide for them, keep this place running so they have a home to grow up in. He turned back to her. You need help you cannot afford to hire. Seems to me we might have a solution. Margaret's heart started beating faster, though she was not sure why. What sort of solution? Marry me. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that for a moment Margaret thought she had misheard. What? Marry me? Colton repeated, as calm as if he was discussing the weather. It makes sense. My ranch runs right up against yours. We could combine them, make one larger operation. You would have the help you need. Those kids would have a stable home, food on the table, a future. They would have a father. They have me, Margaret said, but her voice was weak. They need more than you can give them alone, and you know it. He said it gently, but the truth of it still stung. I am not saying you have not been trying. I am saying you need help. You need me. Margaret looked at this stranger, this man who had appeared out of nowhere with the most ridiculous proposal she had ever heard. You do not even know me. I know you are loyal. I know you are stubborn as a mule. I know you love those kids enough to work yourself into the ground for them. He shrugged. That is more than a lot of marriages start with. This is insane. Margaret pressed her hands to her temples, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why would you want to marry a woman you do not know and take on 2 children who are not yours? For the first time, something shifted in Colton's expression, a flicker of something she could not quite read. I have a ranch that runs fine but could run better with the right partner. I am tired of eating my own cooking and going to sleep in an empty house. And I have always wanted children, but it seems I am not the settling down type according to most women. His mouth quirked up slightly. Plus, you clearly need help and I am in a position to give it. That is not a reason to get married. It is a practical one. This is not a fairy tale, Miss Nelson. This is Gunnison, Colorado in 1878. Practical beats romantic when you are trying to survive a winter. Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to take his proposal and ride back to his ranch. But she thought about Emma asking if they were going to have to leave. She thought about Thomas's wide, scared eyes. She thought about the dwindling supplies, the broken fence, the impossible list of tasks she could not complete alone. She thought about the whispers in the general store about orphanages. I need time to think, she finally said. Fair enough, but do not take too long. Spring is coming, and there is work that needs doing before planting season. He swung back up onto his horse with that same easy grace. I will send some men to fix this fence tomorrow, regardless of your answer. Like I said, it is a neighbor thing. He rode away, leaving Margaret standing in the trampled snow, her mind spinning with the absurdity of what had just happened. She walked back to the house in a daze, the conversation repeating in her head like a song she could not stop humming. Emma was setting the table when Margaret came inside, carefully placing the mismatched plates like she had seen her mother do. Thomas was playing with wooden blocks on the floor, building towers only to knock them down again. They both looked up when she entered, and Margaret saw the trust in their eyes, the absolute faith that she would take care of them. She thought about Colton Garrison's words. They need a father. You need me. Maybe he was right. That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat at the small table with a piece of paper and a pencil, making a list. On one side, all the reasons she should say no to Colton's proposal. It was rushed, it was practical to the point of being cold. She did not know him, she did not love him, she had never even considered marriage before now. On the other side, all the reasons she should say yes. The children would be safe. They would have a home. She would have help. They might not starve or freeze. The second list was shorter, but every item on it mattered more than anything on the first list. When Colton's ranch hands showed up the next morning to fix the fence, Margaret was waiting. 3 men on horseback, respectful and professional, carrying the tools and materials needed for the job. They tipped their hats to her and got to work without asking for direction or payment. Margaret watched them from the house, and the sight of that fence being repaired, strong and straight, made something tight in her chest loosen just slightly. 2 days later, she rode the ancient horse over to Colton's ranch. It was bigger than she had expected, a sprawling operation with a large barn, multiple outbuildings, and a house that was solid and well-maintained. Cattle grazed in vast pastures, more than she could quickly count. This was not a struggling ranch like her brother's had been. This was an established operation, successful and stable. Colton came out of the barn when he heard her approach, wiping his hands on a rag. "Miss Nelson decided to take me up on my offer." "I want to discuss terms first," Margaret said, staying on the horse because it made her feel less vulnerable, more in control. His eyebrows rose slightly. "All right, come inside. I will make coffee." She dismounted, tying the horse to the rail outside his house, and followed him inside. The interior was clean but sparse, clearly a man's space with none of the touches that made a house a home. Functional furniture, bare walls, everything organized with military precision. Colton poured coffee from a pot on the stove, strong and black, and handed her a cup. They sat across from each other at his kitchen table, and Margaret forced herself to meet his eyes. "If I agree to this," she said carefully, "I need to know what you expect. A partnership, someone to help run the household, to manage things while I am working the ranch. Someone to share the load." He paused, then added, "A real marriage eventually. I'm not looking for just a housekeeper." Margaret felt heat creep up her neck. "I need time. I cannot just jump into being a wife in all ways to a stranger." "That is fair. We can take things slow." He sipped his coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. "What else? The children. They call the shots. If this does not work, if they are unhappy, then the arrangement ends." "Agreed, but give it a real chance. Kids adjust to more than adults give them credit for." "I want to keep my brother's ranch. Not sell it, not let it go. Combine them like you said, but that land is Emma and Thomas's inheritance." Colton nodded slowly. "We can do that. Put it in writing if you want, leave it to them in a will." Margaret had not expected him to agree so readily. "You have thought about this?" "I have been alone for a long time, Miss Nelson. When I make a decision, I think it through." He set down his coffee cup. "Anything else? I need to know why, really why. This seems like a lot of trouble for someone you do not know." Colton was quiet for a moment, and something shifted in his expression, became less guarded. "My parents died when I was young. Cholera. My older brother raised me, built this ranch from nothing so I would have something. He died 2 years ago, and I have been running it alone since. I know what it is like to be a kid who lost everything. I know what it means when someone steps up to take care of you." He met her eyes. "Those kids need someone. You are trying to be that someone, but you are drowning. I can help. And maybe along the way we build something good. That is why." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. Margaret felt something in her chest, a softening toward this stern, practical man who was offering her a lifeline. "All right," she said quietly. "I will marry you." Colton did not smile, but his expression lightened. "Good. We can do it this Saturday if that works for you. Small ceremony, just the basics. Then you and the kids can move your things over here. This house is bigger, and it is in better shape than your brother's." "Wait, this Saturday? That is 4 days from now. No point in dragging it out. You need help now, not in a month." He stood up, extending his hand. "We have a deal." Margaret stood as well, taking his hand. His grip was warm and calloused, the hand of a working man. "We have a deal." She rode back to her brother's ranch feeling like she had just made a deal with the devil or an angel, and she was not quite sure which. When she told Emma and Thomas that evening, trying to explain in ways they could understand, Emma's first question was practical and heartbreaking. "Will we still live in our house?" "No, sweetheart. We are going to live in Mr. Garrison's house. It is bigger and warmer, but we can visit our house whenever you want. It is still ours." "Is Mr. Garrison going to be our papa now?" Emma asked, and Thomas looked up from his blocks with sudden interest. "He's going to take care of us," Margaret said carefully. "Like a papa would. Is that all right?" Emma thought about this with the seriousness of a much older child. "Will he be nice?" "I think so. I hope so." "Okay," Emma said finally. "But if he is mean, we can leave, right?" "Right," Margaret promised, praying she was not making a terrible mistake. Saturday came too quickly. Margaret wore the best dress she owned, a dark blue wool that she had made herself. She pinned her hair up carefully, her hands shaking slightly. Emma wore a clean dress with a white pinafore, and Thomas wore his church clothes, already too small on him. They rode together in the wagon that Colton had sent for them, driven by one of his ranch hands. The ceremony took place in the small church in Gunnison, witnessed by the minister and two people pulled in from the street to serve as legal witnesses. It was brief and businesslike, the words feeling strange in Margaret's mouth. She was promising to love and honor a man she had known for less than a week. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Colton kissed her cheek, quick and chaste, and then it was done. She was Margaret Garrison now. The name felt foreign. They went to the hotel restaurant for a meal, which Colton said was traditional even if nothing else about this wedding was. Emma and Thomas were on their best behavior, speaking only when spoken to, clearly uncertain about this tall, serious man who was now part of their lives. Colton tried in his own awkward way. He asked Emma about what she liked to do, and she whispered that she liked to draw. He asked Thomas if he liked horses, and Thomas nodded enthusiastically. It was stilted and uncomfortable, but it was an effort, and Margaret appreciated that. When they arrived at Colton's ranch, their new home, Margaret felt a wave of exhaustion hit her. The past weeks had been an endless marathon of worry and work, and now here she was, married to a stranger, about to move into his house with two traumatized children. "The house has 3 bedrooms, Colton said as he showed them inside. "I was thinking Emma and Thomas could share the room at the end of the hall. It is the biggest of the spare rooms. You can take the room next to theirs, and I will stay in the master bedroom." He paused, then added, "For now." Margaret understood what he was saying. Separate rooms until she was ready for more. The relief was almost overwhelming. "Thank you." They spent the rest of the day moving the children's things into their new room, trying to make it feel familiar and safe. Margaret unpacked their clothes, arranged their few toys, hung the drawing Emma's mother had made for her on the wall. Thomas clung to his stuffed rabbit, watching everything with wide eyes. That night, Margaret tucked them into the bed they would share, pulling the quilts up to their chins. "How are you doing?" she asked softly. "It is different," Emma said, "but it is okay. The house is warm." It was warm. Blessedly, wonderfully warm after so many nights of huddling around an inadequate fire. Margaret kissed both their foreheads and left the door cracked open, a lamp burning in the hallway so they would not wake up in the dark. She found Colton in the kitchen, cleaning up from the simple dinner he had prepared. Margaret picked up a towel to dry the dishes he washed, falling into a domestic rhythm that felt bizarre given the circumstances. "They will adjust," Colton said after a long silence. "Kids are resilient. I hope so." Margaret set down a dried plate. "Thank you for giving them their own room. For going slow. Like I said, it is a partnership, no point in rushing what should happen naturally." He glanced at her. "You look exhausted. Go get some sleep." Margaret was tired, bone-deep tired, but she forced herself to ask, What do you need from me? Tomorrow, I mean. What are my responsibilities here? Tomorrow you rest and help the kids settle in. After that, we will figure out a rhythm, but there is no urgency. You have been barely surviving for weeks. Take a breath. His voice was gruff but not unkind. It was permission she had not realized she needed. Margaret felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears. I am not usually this weak. You are not weak, you are tired. There is a difference. Colton dried his hands on a towel. Go on, get some sleep. Margaret went to her new room, closed the door, and sat on the bed that was softer than any she had slept on in months. She looked around at the plain walls, the simple furniture, and tried to absorb the fact that this was her life now. She was married. She had a new home. The children were safe and warm. She cried quietly into her pillow, from exhaustion and relief and confusion, and eventually fell into the deepest sleep she had had in months. The first weeks of her marriage were a study in adjustment. Margaret learned the rhythms of Colton's ranch, which was so much larger and more complex than her brother's small operation. There were ranch hands who came and went, work that happened on schedules she had to learn, meals that needed to be prepared for more than just 3 people. Colton worked from dawn to dusk, managing the cattle, directing his men, handling the 1,000 details that kept a ranch running. He was patient with Margaret's questions, teaching her what she needed to know without making her feel stupid for not knowing it already. He was gentle with the children, making space for them in his life without pushing too hard. Emma started to relax first, drawn out by Colton's quiet presence. He let her follow him around sometimes, explaining what he was doing, answering her endless questions. He carved her a set of wooden animals that she treasured. When she showed him her drawings, he studied them seriously and told her they were good, and Margaret could see her niece bloom under the attention. Thomas took longer. At 4, he did not fully understand why his parents were gone or who this new man was. But Colton was patient, letting the boy approach in his own time. He taught Thomas to feed the chickens, a job small enough for little hands. He lifted him up to see the newborn calf in the barn. Slowly, Thomas's wariness faded. Margaret watched these interactions with a complicated mix of emotions. Gratitude, certainly. Relief that Colton was good to the children. But also something else, something warmer that she was not quite ready to examine too closely. She and Colton existed in a strange state of formal politeness. They shared meals. They discussed the running of the household and ranch. They coordinated care for the children. But they were still strangers in many ways, careful not to intrude too much into each other's lives. At night, Margaret lay in her room and knew Colton was just down the hall. She thought about his words. A real marriage eventually. She was not sure how she felt about that. He was handsome in a rough way, and he had been nothing but decent to her. But she had never thought much about romance or physical intimacy, had been too busy with survival to consider such things. One evening in late March, Margaret was in the kitchen making bread when Colton came in from a day on the range. He was dirty and tired, but he stopped when he saw her, something shifting in his expression. "Smells good," he said, nodding to the bread. "It will be ready soon. There is hot water if you want to wash up." Margaret had taken over the task of keeping the stove stoked and water heated, a small thing that made the evenings easier. Colton poured water into the basin, rolling up his sleeves. As he washed, Margaret found herself watching the play of muscles in his forearms, the capable way he moved. When he caught her looking, she quickly turned back to her bread, feeling her face heat. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. They had been calling each other Miss Nelson and Mr. Garrison, then just avoiding names altogether. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." How are you doing, really? Not just getting through the day, but actually doing. Margaret considered the question. Better, more stable. The children are happier. I am not waking up every morning terrified about how we will survive. She met his eyes. You kept your promises. I appreciate that. It has been good having you here. The house feels different, better. He seemed to struggle for words, his usual terseness failing him. I am glad you said yes. I am too, Margaret said softly and realized she meant it. Something passed between them, a moment of connection that went deeper than their practical arrangement. Colton held her gaze and Margaret felt her heart beat faster. Then Emma burst into the kitchen, asking if the bread was ready, and the moment broke. But it had happened. Something had shifted. As the weather warmed and spring settled over the valley, Margaret found herself settling too. She learned to manage the household, to work with Colton's ranch hands, to make this house a home. She planted a garden, teaching Emma and Thomas to help her. She made new curtains for the windows, adding small touches of beauty to the functional space. And she watched Colton. Watched him with the children, patient and kind. Watched him work, capable and strong. Watched him at the dinner table, his eyes finding hers across the plates. Watched him and felt something growing in her chest that she had not expected. She was starting to care for him. More than care, maybe. One evening in early May, after the children were asleep, Margaret found Colton on the porch, looking out over the land. She had taken to joining him sometimes, these quiet moments at the end of the day. Tonight she sat in the chair next to his, and they were silent for a while, listening to the night sounds. I have been thinking, Margaret said finally, about us, this arrangement. She made herself look at him. You said you wanted a real marriage eventually. I have been thinking maybe eventually does not have to be so far away. Colton turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable in the dim light. What are you saying? I am saying I am not afraid anymore. I am saying you have been good to me and the children. I am saying maybe we could try being more than just two people sharing a house. Her heart was pounding, her palms sweating, but she forced herself to continue. If you still want that, Margaret. He said her name like it meant something, like it was important. I am not going to push you. You can have all the time you need. I know, but I do not need more time. I need you to know that I am ready to be your wife, really be your wife. Colton reached over and took her hand, his rough palm warm against hers. You are sure? I am sure. He stood, pulling her up with him, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then he leaned down and kissed her, and it was nothing like the chaste peck at their wedding. This was real and warm and full of promise. Margaret's hands came up to his shoulders, and she kissed him back, feeling something bloom inside her that was entirely new. When they finally pulled apart, Colton rested his forehead against hers. I have wanted to do that for weeks. Why did you not? Because I wanted you to come to me. I wanted it to be your choice. He cupped her face in his hands. You have had too many choices taken from you lately. I was not going to be another one. Margaret felt her eyes sting with emotion. This man, this practical, gruff man who had offered her a marriage of convenience, was turning out to be so much more than she had ever expected. Take me to bed, Colton. He did, leading her down the hall to his room, their room now. He was gentle and patient, and if Margaret was nervous, he eased her fears with steady hands and soft words. They came together in the darkness, and it felt right in a way Margaret had not known to expect. This was not just physical necessity or duty. This was connection, real and growing stronger. Afterward, lying in Colton's arms, Margaret felt a sense of peace she had not known in months, maybe ever. She had come to this marriage out of desperation, but somewhere along the way, it had become something real. I am falling in love with you, she whispered into the darkness. Colton's arms tightened around her. Good, because I already fell for you weeks ago. The spring turned to summer, and Margaret's life took on a fullness she had never imagined. She woke in Colton's arms, helped him with the morning chores, cared for the children, managed the household. She learned to ride properly, not just the tentative plodding she had done before. She learned about cattle and crops and all the intricacies of ranch life. Emma and Thomas called Colton Papa now, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. He had earned it, with his patience and his steady presence and the security he provided. They were healing, becoming children again instead of scared little shadows. Margaret's feelings for Colton deepened with each passing day. She loved the way he was with the children, the way he made her laugh with dry observations about his ranch hands or the stubborn calf that kept escaping its pen. She loved his hands, scarred and capable, and the way he touched her in the night. She loved his mind, practical and intelligent, always thinking 3 steps ahead. And Colton, for his part, showed his love in 100 small ways. Fresh flowers left on the kitchen table. A new stove ordered from Denver because he noticed her struggling with the old one. Taking the children out for rides so she could have an afternoon to herself. The way he looked at her across the room, like she was something precious. One evening in July, they were lying in bed after making love, the window open to the summer breeze. "I want to combine the ranches officially," Colton said. "Make it legal. Expand the house, add on so the kids can have their own rooms as they get older. Build something permanent." "I would like that." Margaret traced patterns on his chest. "James would be happy, I think. That his land is being used, that his children have a good life." "They are our children now," Colton said firmly. "Emma and Thomas are mine as much as they are yours." "I know." Margaret smiled in the darkness. "You have been more of a father to them than some men are to their own blood." "I want more," Colton said. "More children, I mean, if you do. I would like Emma and Thomas to have siblings. I would like to have a baby with you." Margaret had not thought about it, but as soon as he said it, she realized she wanted it too. "Yes, I would like that very much." They tried that night and many nights after, until in early September, Margaret realized her monthly courses had not come. She waited another month to be sure, then told Colton one morning before he headed out to work. His face transformed with joy. He picked her up and spun her around, then set her down carefully like she might break. "Are you happy?" "So happy," Margaret said and kissed him. They told Emma and Thomas that evening, explaining that they would have a baby brother or sister in the spring. Emma was excited, already planning what she would teach the baby. Thomas was less sure but interested in the idea. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Margaret continued her work, though Colton became almost comically protective, not wanting her to lift anything heavy or work too hard. She rolled her eyes at his fussing but secretly loved it. Winter came again, and Margaret thought about the previous winter, cold and desperate and terrified. What a difference a year made. Now she was warm and safe, surrounded by people she loved, carrying a child, and married to a man who was everything she had never known to hope for. Their son was born in March of 1879, exactly a year after Colton had first proposed. They named him James, after Margaret's brother, and he was perfect. Colton held his son with shaking hands, this big, strong rancher reduced to awe by a tiny baby. Emma and Thomas were fascinated by their baby brother, wanting to help with everything. They had adjusted beautifully to their new life, and watching them with little James, Margaret knew she had made the right choice all those months ago. The years rolled on, each one better than the last. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. They added on to the house, just as Colton had wanted, giving each child their own room. Margaret gave birth to a daughter 2 years after James, and they named her Sarah after Emma and Thomas's mother. Then another son 2 years after that, named Colton Jr. but called CJ. Emma grew into a lovely young woman who could ride and rope as well as any ranch hand, and who still loved to draw. Thomas became tall and strong, learning the ranch work with serious dedication. James was wild and full of energy. Sarah was quiet and thoughtful. CJ was still a toddler, getting into everything. Margaret looked at her life sometimes and could hardly believe it was real. She had a home, a family, a husband she loved deeply. The desperate woman who had been drowning in work and fear seemed like someone else entirely. One evening in 1885, 7 years after that first meeting at the broken fence, Margaret and Colton sat on their porch watching the sunset. The children were inside, the sounds of their play drifting out through the open windows. "You ever regret it?" Margaret asked. "Taking on a woman with 2 kids, all that responsibility?" Colton looked at her like she had grown a second head. "Regret marrying the love of my life. Regret having the family I always wanted, not for a single second. Even though it started as something practical, not romantic at all. The how it started does not matter as much as where we ended up." He took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I told you that day that you needed me. Turns out I needed you just as much, needed you to make this house a home, needed you to give me a family. Needed you to make me laugh and challenge me and love me." He smiled at her, that rare full smile that still made her heart skip. "Best decision I ever made was riding up to that broken fence. Best decision I ever made was saying yes." Margaret leaned against him, comfortable and content. Though it seemed crazy at the time. The best things often do. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Inside, they could hear Emma teaching Sarah a song, while Thomas helped the younger boys build something that was probably going to end in a crash and tears. It was loud and chaotic and absolutely perfect. Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her here. The grief and fear and desperation. The pride that had almost made her refuse Colton's help. The slow growing of love from the soil of practical necessity. The family they had built, blended from tragedy and choice and commitment. She had come to Gunnison to nurse her dying brother and ended up finding a life she had never imagined. She had been a desperate woman trying to save 2 children and ended up with 5 children and a partner who made every day better. She had married a stranger and ended up with a love story that was real and deep and lasting. "I love you," she told Colton, words she said often but never took for granted. "I love you too," he replied, pulling her closer. The sun set over the Colorado mountains, and Margaret felt profoundly grateful for this man who had seen her struggling and offered help without judgment. For the children, all of them, who filled their home with noise and love. For the ranch that had become her legacy and her future. For the second chances that life sometimes offered if you were brave enough to take them. Inside, something crashed, and they heard Thomas shout. "It is okay, Papa, we can fix it." Colton sighed but smiled. "I should probably go see what they broke." "Probably," Margaret agreed, but neither of them moved yet. They had time. They had each other. They had built something solid and real and lasting. The desperate proposal at a broken fence had become a marriage that mended so much more than property lines. It had mended hearts and lives and futures. The stars started to come out, and finally, Colton stood, pulling Margaret up with him. They went inside together, into the warm light and happy chaos of their home, to their children who needed them, to the life they had built one choice at a time. It was not the fairy tale Margaret had read about as a girl. It was better because it was real. It was work and compromise and patience and commitment. It was laughter at the breakfast table and whispered conversations in the night. It was watching children grow and helping them through struggles and celebrating their victories. It was two people who had started as strangers becoming the most important person in each other's lives. As Margaret tucked Sarah into bed that night, her daughter asked, "Mama, how did you and Papa fall in love?" Margaret thought about all the real reasons and all the complicated emotions, but she smiled and said simply, "He saw I needed help, and he was brave enough to offer it. And I was brave enough to accept. Everything else followed from there." "That is a good story," Sarah said sleepily. "It is," Margaret agreed. "It is a very good story." She kissed her daughter good night and went to check on the boys, then to the room where Emma was already reading in bed, almost grown now. Margaret said good night to her too, this child who had become hers in all the ways that mattered. Finally, she went to her own room where Colton was already in bed, reading a farming journal. He looked up when she entered, and the love in his eyes still made her breath catch after all these years. "Everyone settled?" he asked. "Everyone settled." She climbed into bed beside him, fitting into his arms like she belonged there because she did. "Good day?" he asked, as he did every night. Margaret thought about her day, the work and the challenges and the small joys, the garden that was doing well, Emma's laughter at breakfast, Thomas's pride in a job well done, the baby James's first words that morning, Sarah's questions, CJ's sticky kiss, and through it all Colton, steady and present in hers. "Perfect day," she said, and she meant it. Not perfect because everything went right, but perfect because it was her life, the one she had chosen, the one she had built with this good man beside her. The life that had started with such fear and desperation had become something beautiful. They made love that night, familiar and intimate, comfortable in their knowledge of each other. Afterward, drifting toward sleep, Margaret thought about how much had changed since that day she stood at a broken fence, trying not to cry from frustration and fear. A rancher had ridden up and changed everything with a proposal that seemed insane. "You need me," he had said. And he had been right. But what he had not said, what neither of them had known then, was that he needed her just as much. They had needed each other, and they had been brave enough to take a chance on a practical arrangement that became the greatest love either of them had known. Margaret fell asleep in her husband's arms, in the house full of children, on the ranch that had become her home, and she was happy. Not the fleeting happiness of a perfect moment, but the deep contentment of a life well lived, a good choice made, a love earned and nurtured and grown into something that would last. The years continued to pass, each bringing its own challenges and joys. The ranch grew and prospered. The children grew and developed their own dreams. Margaret and Colton grew older together, their love deepening with each shared experience. Emma eventually married a young man from a neighboring ranch, and Margaret watched her walk down the aisle with pride and just a touch of wistfulness for the scared 7-year-old she had been. Thomas decided he wanted to be a veterinarian and went to study back east, writing long letters home about his studies. James took to ranch work like he was born for it, planning to take over the operation someday. Sarah developed a love for teaching and started a small school on the ranch for the local children. CJ was still young, still figuring out his path. Through it all, Margaret and Colton were partners in the truest sense. They made decisions together, supported each other through difficulties, celebrated each other's victories. They fought sometimes because real marriages do, but they always came back together, always remembered what they had built and why. On their 10th anniversary, Colton surprised Margaret with a trip to Denver, leaving the children in the care of his ranch hands and Emma, who was 18 and capable. In the city where Margaret had once worked as a seamstress, barely scraping by, they stayed in a nice hotel and went to restaurants and shows. Colton bought her a new dress and a necklace she protested was too expensive. They walked through the streets holding hands like young lovers. "Do you miss it?" Colton asked one evening as they strolled past the boarding house where she had once lived. "City life." Margaret looked at the building, remembering the small room she had rented, the constant worry about money, the loneliness of having no real family nearby. "Not for a second. That was not a life. What we have is a life." They went back to the hotel that night and made love like they had all the time in the world, because they did. They had built something that would last, something that would outlive them in the children they were raising and the land they were tending. The years turned and the children grew, and Margaret's hair started to show silver at the temples. Colton's face gained more lines, weathered from years in the sun. They were aging together, and somehow that was beautiful too. When Emma had her first child, making Margaret a grandmother at 41, she held the baby girl and thought about cycles and generations. This child would grow up hearing stories about her grandmother who had been brave enough to raise her uncle and aunt when their parents died, who had married a rancher she barely knew, who had built a family from heartbreak and determination. Thomas came home from his studies to set up a veterinary practice in Gunnison, close enough to help with the ranch and far enough to have his own life. He found a wife, a school teacher from back east who had come west for adventure, and they built their own life together. James worked the ranch alongside his father, learning everything Colton could teach him. He was good at it, with an instinct for cattle and land that could not be taught. When he fell in love with a neighbor's daughter and married her, they built a house on the ranch land, keeping the operation in the family. Sarah's school thrived, and she proved to be a natural teacher, patient and creative. She drew students from all the surrounding ranches, giving them an education they might not have otherwise had. She eventually married one of Thomas's friends from school, a lawyer who set up practice in Gunnison. CJ was the wanderer, the one who needed to see what was beyond the mountains. He went to California for a few years, worked on different ranches, saw the ocean. But he came home eventually, as Margaret had known he would, because home was the ranch and the family they had built there. Margaret watched her children grow and make their own lives, and she felt the satisfaction of a job well done. She had kept her promise to Emma all those years ago. They had stayed. They had made this work. They had built something lasting. On a spring evening in 1895, Margaret and Colton sat on their porch, a ritual they had maintained for 17 years of marriage. They were both in their 50s now, still healthy and active, but with the sense that time was precious, that each day was a gift. "We did all right, did we not?" Margaret said, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "Better than all right," Colton replied, his hand finding hers with the ease of long practice. "We did better than I ever dreamed. Do you remember that first day, when you proposed at the broken fence?" "I remember a stubborn woman with mud on her face who looked like she was going to shoot me for offering to help." Colton chuckled. "I remember thinking she was brave and foolish in equal measure. I remember thinking you were insane. Who proposes marriage to a stranger?" "A practical man who saw a solution to two problems." He squeezed her hand. "Turned out to be the best decision I ever made." "We were lucky," Margaret said. "It could have gone so differently. We could have been miserable together." "It was not luck. It was work. We both chose to make it good. We both chose each other every day." Colton looked at her, and his eyes were soft with love. "I would choose you again every time. I would choose you too." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable and content. "Thank you for riding up to my broken fence that day. Thank you for saying yes." They sat in silence as the stars came out, and inside the house, they could hear the sounds of family. James and his wife were visiting with their children, Margaret and Colton's grandchildren, and the house was full of noise and life and love. This was what they had built, not just a successful ranch or a big house or financial security, though they had all those things. They had built a family, connected by blood and choice and commitment. They had built a love that had started as practical necessity and become the foundation of everything good in their lives. Margaret thought about the woman she had been, standing in the cold beside her brother's grave, terrified and alone. She thought about the choice she had made, desperate and uncertain. She thought about the journey from that moment to this one, all the challenges and joys and ordinary days that had added up to a life. It had not been easy. There had been hard years, difficult moments, times when she questioned everything. But through it all, Colton had been there, steady and strong, her partner in all things. And she had been there for him, making his house a home, giving him the family he had always wanted, loving him with everything she had. "I love you," she said, words that never got old. "I love you too," he replied, as he had 10,000 times before and would 10,000 times again. The sun finished setting, and the night wrapped around them like a blanket. They stayed on the porch a little longer, unwilling to let go of the peaceful moment. Finally, they went inside together, into the warm light of home, to the grandchildren who wanted bedtime stories, and the son who wanted advice and the daughter-in-law who needed help with a recipe. They went inside to their life, the one they had built from a desperate proposal and a brave acceptance, from broken fences and broken hearts that had healed stronger than before. They went inside to love and family, and all the messy, beautiful reality of a life well lived together. And in the years that followed, as they grew older and the grandchildren multiplied and the ranch continued to prosper, Margaret never regretted her choice. She had been raising her brother's kids alone, drowning in work she could not do and responsibilities she could not meet. The rancher had said they needed a father, and she needed him. He had been right on both counts. But what he had not known, what neither of them could have predicted, was how much he would need her too. How they would save each other in ways that went far beyond practical help. How they would fall in love slowly and thoroughly, building something real and lasting from the most unlikely beginning. It was not a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. It was work and choice and commitment and love that grew deeper with each passing year. It was the story of two people who took a chance on each other and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. And when Margaret was very old, sitting on that same porch with Colton's hand in hers, she looked back on her life and knew she would not change a single thing. The heartbreak had led to healing. The desperation had led to hope. The broken fence had led to everything good and true and lasting in her life. She had said yes to a rancher's proposal, and in doing so, she had said yes to love, to family, to a future she had never imagined. It was the best yes she had ever given. The end.